members, staff, guests, and members of the public are reminded that the full authority board committee meeting is being recorded and it will be posted to the authority's website along with the official written minutes. As such, comments and opinions expressed may be published, and any comments expressed by individual board members, guests, and the general public are their own and do not represent the opinions or comments of the full authority and/or the KCCA board of directors. The recorded video of the full authority meeting is not considered the official record of the meeting. The official record of the full authority meeting shall consist solely of the minutes approved by the full authority. So we are only missing one member. Linda's here on the telephone. Good morning, Linda.
Good morning.
And so Elizabeth's not here, but everyone else is here. Introductions, declarations of pecuniary interest. Anyone declaring anything today? Seeing none. Let's move right into the matters arising.
Mr. Chair, I added this to the agenda this morning. So we did attend a meeting with Minister Yurick and his staff in Toronto. Grant was able to join me as well as Steve and Joe. Really, it was much more of a discussion. I get to know each other, I guess, and to get to know KCCA. Some of the questions that were asked, and that's really the format that it took, was just staff asking us questions and responding to them. We gave a brief overview of the watershed and KCCA in general. Some of the questions they were interested in is what made RCA unique, what were some of our defining characteristics. So we talked about the flash nature of flooding in our watershed, mainly agriculture, a lot of erosion, especially along the shoreline. They asked things like how many people attend our board meetings, some partnerships that you currently have, how many flood warnings we issued, environmental monitoring programs, just I guess a real just knowledge sharing about our different programs and services. One thing we did have some discussions on was amalgamation. I think that came up on whether or not this authority was open to any form of amalgamation. Lots of discussion about programs and services, as well as whether our local municipalities set levy targets. And we spoke specifically about London, that they set their target, and we tried to work within that as well. I don't know if Grant and Steve have anything to add or general comments on the meeting.
I think after the meeting, I think we had a positive feeling about it, but it was quite obvious that they were searching, right? They're formulating their strategy, and you can see the generic quality of their questions. I don't think there was anything that was really too specific to us that wouldn't have applied to other people as well. So the information sheet that staff put together was excellent. It really sort of gave an overall, whoever did that, I'm not sure who was the brainchild behind that, but it certainly gave a very good overview of the whole, what we were, who we are, and what we're doing. So.
Minister Yurick did indicate that at some point in the near future, he wants roundtable discussions after they do their investigations with the various CAs. So we'll see where that takes us, I guess. And when that happens, they had a deadline in the spring for
March, I think, is when we can sort of plan on getting some sort of idea. Ralph, you had a question?
Well, just a comment. In the paper the last couple of days, i.e. the London Free Press, there's been a lot of backtracking by our Premier on some of these impositions of limits. And I'm wondering whether the CAs have never been mentioned, but I'm wondering if we aren't likely to see a bit of backtracking.
It was the last night on the news they talked about they went into reserves $550 million in order to sort of back up some of the things that were stated, right? Which indicates that there is some sort of rethinking of everything. So
Yes.
we can cross our fingers.
Well, that's what I was hoping for.
But they did give us ample opportunity to express our feelings.
Yes, it was quite open and quite frank discussion on a lot of stuff. So. Which was good.
And just as Grant mentioned, they did say that there's hopefully another round of consultations coming up in January. That will be more roundtable and extend out to other agencies as well. So I'm assuming that'll be stakeholders like municipalities and other organizations like that. And there's some talk of whether or not those would be regional discussions, which we'll wait and see what form that takes.
Dominique, you had a question?
Just curious if the whole concept of core, non-core, which was a lot of the source of the confusion in the letter, did that come up at all?
It wasn't raised by ministry staff in terms of where we saw our programs and services fitting into that discussion. I think that from our presentation, we tried to stress that we didn't feel that we were going beyond what we considered core. The programs and services that we deliver today are the same programs and services that were discussed in our 1967 conservation report. I think the other thing we stressed in terms of the discussion of core and non-core, at the end of the meeting, they asked if there was anything else that we wanted to stress. And I took that opportunity just to stress how important our campgrounds are to our ability to maintain and keep our levy not astronomically increasing, that our campgrounds are actually offsetting some of our programs and services. And so to lose them would have a devastating impact on our ability to deliver the programs that we have right now.
I anticipate that they're going to see a commonality amongst the CAs that they speak to, and then that core mandate may very well expand, because they're gonna see, well, everybody's doing this and everybody's doing that, so maybe that is part of the core, right, that they haven't necessarily anticipated before. Rob?
Yeah, has there been any further comment on tree planting? That didn't seem to be a real high priority previously, but is this not something that should be a high priority, or is there any comment on it?
Not at this meeting, no, there hasn't been comment on that. I think, as we reported at the board before, the Forest Ontario program, the federal government has come in to save that, so that is continuing, at least for 2020. So there's been that assistance to the tree planting program locally, but as a discussion at the provincial level, I mean, we highlighted our tree planting program at the meeting, but there wasn't any specific questions of the ministry of us on that.
KCCA?
Question, please.
Sure. Go ahead, Linda.
I was just wondering, Elizabeth, you touched a little bit on the amalgamation of conservation areas, and maybe if I don't take it quite so far, did they talk about partnerships and sharing of services or staff or any of that?
Grant, if you want to.
That was discussed, that was part of the discussion, various options, may not be full amalgamation, but there's definitely was some discussion, not a lot, but what could be achieved.
And was the ministry willing to be part of that discussion, or did you get the feeling that they wanted us to initiate?
I haven't heard amalgamate, so most of the questions that have been asked of each CA have been quite similar. They seem to be going through a template of questions. Minister Yurk hasn't sat in on all of the meetings. He did sit in on our meeting. And if I remember correctly, amalgamation was a topic that he raised, not staff. So it was very much, I think, more coming at it from a local perspective than any ministry initiative.
Now, has Kettle Creek had their meeting yet?
Catfish?
The Catfish, rather?
Catfish had theirs on Halloween.
Okay.
Okay, well, I look forward to further discussion on that. And I'm not sure whether the ministry will initiate or not, but certainly look forward to further discussion.
I think, sort of as a summary, I would say that the picture of Kettle Creek that was brought forward was very positive, very much reflective of the stuff that we do as far as our community involvement, as far as our stewardship for the lands, and the fact that we seem to be doing what our interpretation of the Conservation Act really expects us to do. So we're not off in the hinterlands doing questionable activities. We're salt of the earth kind of stuff, and I think that was really very much carried through to the ministry. So, Rob?
One other quick comment. That is with regard to Long Point, and it was something I read, and it could have been in that book that I just gave to you earlier this morning, Elizabeth. But the Long Point seems to have a lot of money. Where do they get it and what do they do?
I don't know, Mr. Chair to Ralph, if I'm qualified to answer that. I think in the past, Long Point has been, had the luxury of a lot of lands that I know that they have forested at a level that probably isn't seen at a lot of the other CAs.
Exactly. Yeah. But do they have a lot of private money that's rolling in there?
I don't know that.
Because there is.
But I do know they had a more substantial forestry, like active forestry harvesting program that they counted on funds for.
Great, excellent. Any other questions at all, folks? Excellent, thank you. Once again, thanks very much to our staff for such a great presentation to the minister, and we anticipate positive things coming out of these discussions. So, excellent, thank you. Okay, correspondence?
No correspondence.
No correspondence. So, statement of revenue and expenses.
No statements.
No statements. Any revenues?
Clearly stated.
Okay, new business, budget 2020-2023.
Mr. Chair, I'll start off these presentations with the reserve policy that was put out in your advance package. So I'm looking for acceptance of the reserve policy today, as well as some year-end transfers of reserves that I'm proposing are no longer needed at the authority, and the funds can probably be put into other reserves where funds are needed. So the policy, I shaped the policy on a lot of drafts that I had seen from other organizations, and really it does a bunch of things. It defines the types of reserves that we would establish, defines how we would establish the reserves, how funds are transferred, and the overall management of the reserves. And then in the review of those reserves that we currently have, I'm suggesting that the Community Forest Reserve and the Dan Patterson Conservation Area Reserve are no longer required and should be folded, and those funds moved to more appropriate places. So in terms of definition, there's basically two reserves that the authority has. Discretionary, so they've been established for future operational expenses that are intermittent in nature. A good example would be the legal reserve. So set aside for when we have a legal matter that we can't accommodate within the normal budget. And non-discretionary are reserves that have been set up because of a requirement of a contract. And a good example of that is the Carolinian Forest Festival. So our staff manage that festival, but it's a committee outside of this office. They have reserve funds that we hold for them when they need it. The creations of reserves would be very typical to how we've been operating, but this formalizes it in an actual policy. So it would require a resolution of the board unless it's a reserve that we have to establish because of contract or legislation. The staff recommendation for the reserve would have the rationale for creating the reserve, where the reserve funds are going to come from, a target balance for the reserve if we know that or want to set something like that, and the amount and timing of projected disbursements. So how are we going to use that reserve moving forward? Transfers to and from reserves. Transfer to reserves must be approved by a board resolution unless required by law and contract. And if you look back through the authority packages, we usually have a report in November or December asking for the board's permission to allocate funds to or from reserves as part of the year end. So that would continue. A transfer from reserves must be approved by the board, but I'm suggesting that if the transfer has been included in the budget, when the budget's approved, that transfer has been approved, but any year-in transfers would need to come back to the board for approval with a separate motion. In terms of reporting, we would report on the reserves annually. They're always seen in the audited financial statements. It includes a balance of each of the reserves. And again, at the final quarter of the year, sometime within the final quarter of the year, staff would report on each reserve, forecasted year-end balances, and make recommendations for board approvals in terms of to and from. And the reserve listing would be updated annually, so you get an annual list of each, where we are with the reserves. In terms of the reserves that, in reviewing them for this report, that I would say is for obsolete, the Community Forest Reserve, that was something established way back when we didn't have the independent trust. We actually had a fundraising committee of the board, and they had fundraised for a community forest. Community forest is basically the forest as you drive into the office there. Those trees have been planted in memory or celebration of life. So there was a reserve there set aside for tree plantings as we got donations in. That forest is kind of met its capacity. There's no more trees that we can put in there that aren't sacrificed to highway salt. So we no longer really kind of run that program. We take donations for tree plantings and then plant the trees anywhere in the watershed, not dedicated to that forest. So I'm suggesting the funds that are left in that reserve, it hasn't been used in a number of years, that those funds, basically $2,600, would be moved over to the Watershed Rehabilitation Reserve, which is our tree planting reserve and helps our tree planting program. The Dan Patterson Conservation Reserve, again, another historical one that was set up when we still ran that Conservation Fund Committee, and it was put in place for funds to help the structures down at Dan Patterson and any upgrades to Dan Patterson. Since that time, we now have our capital reserves where we pull money for any capital improvements down there, as well as the trust has money dedicated specifically to Dan Patterson Conservation Area. So those funds are no longer needed for that. So I'm suggesting they be put in the building replacement reserve for capital infrastructure. So the actual motion that I have before you today for consideration is that the draft reserve policy be accepted, and further that at year end the balance of funds held in the Community Forest Reserve be transferred to the Watershed Rehabilitation Reserve, and finally that at year end the balance of funds held in Dan Patterson Conservation Area Reserve be transferred to the Building Replacement Reserve.
Any questions at all, folks? Just take a look at it. It's great. Motion?
So moved.
By Joe, seconded by Grant. Any other discussion at all? All in favor? Carried. Okay, thank you.
Five-year capital plan, and I'm going to roll in the five-year capital plan. You'll see that underneath it there is a separate report on the vehicle and equipment replacement scoring for 2019 and 2020. I'm going to kind of roll those into the same presentation. They really are fit together. So overall, the capital infrastructure of the authority is structurally good. We do have the renovation or replacement of the administration center is on the horizon. We've had some discussions of that of late. Staff did consult with a local builder. I believe it was Elizabeth Pelosa that suggested that there might be she wanted a price on bringing this building up to accessibility standards and possibly looking at another hybrid motion of bringing some offices up to the main level and concentrating on renovations on the main level. So I did bring a local builder in to discuss that. Through that, we had a hybrid option was discussed, and that was leaving the existing boardroom as is and adding a new additional office space as an entry, a space off kind of this direction of the office. His estimated cost for that was still $754,000 to look at something like that. He's advising that any renovation would require a hazard assessment, so he just wants to make sure that there would be no asbestos or anything else in the office, so that would be another expense added to that. In general, he agreed. He had a full look at the Wilson Diaz report. He agreed mainly with the recommendations in there that a new build would be more efficient, less maintenance, and a better floor plan that actually works for how we want it to work moving forward. He actually increased the cost of the estimated new build to around $968,000, which doesn't include any incidentals like new office furniture or anything like that. So you see in the capital projections have actually looked at $1 million basically for a new build. The 5-year projections, other than something to do with the administration center are very limited to need based on input from that vehicle and equipment scoring. The campgrounds budget on average push about $43,000 to these reserves annually over the next 5 years, but that's not enough to project a new build within the next 4 years. So $1 million is just not in the books. I do have ongoing discussion with the builder to see if, basically one of his recommendations is if generally the office is working for us, there might be things that we can do that doesn't take us to the scale of a new build or the massive renovations that would require to put an addition on. One of the things that I'm waiting for a price tag on with him is actually insulating the basement walls without deepening the basement. So that was one of Wilson Dias' suggestions in terms of lighting and making the space more comfortable, was to lower the basement floor. That's what's really, I think, adding to the cost of a basement renovation. So I'm getting the builder to give us a cost on just insulating the basement, which would hopefully better the airflow and the overall comfort level of the office as a starting step. So I'm waiting for that. I believe that, I put this in your advanced report too, that if we wanted to look at a new build, it would require some type of partnership with another agency or entity to really take that on. It's not something, my aim at looking at a new build was that we wouldn't place this burden on our municipalities, that we would somehow look at self-funding it. That's how I've taken a look at all of our capital infrastructures over the past 10 years. But the campground simply can't support that, especially in the environment that we're in now, where we're looking at the campgrounds to support, really keep that municipal levy down and support some of our other programs and services. There's only so much they can do for us. So in terms of vehicle and equipment replacement, Scott looks at our vehicles and does a ranking on them every year, both the vehicles and our machinery. He's looking at things like the age, the number of kilometers, the type of use, the condition of the drivetrain. And really what we're trying to determine there is, can we get more years out of the vehicles and equipment that we have? Okay, they've reached the end of their capital life, but how many more years can we get good service out of them? And so he ranks those out. Those scorecards were included in your advanced packages. Mainly there was 2 vehicles that scored out that are in need of replacement for 2020, and those are included in the capital plan. There's 1 vehicle, we're estimating a budgeted cost of $29,000. That would replace the 2008 Dodge Dakota that's mainly shared by field staff and office staff. We would continue to keep the 2004 F-150. It's really seen as a spare vehicle, only used at the height of our season. So basically it's a workhorse. There's no sense replacing it. We'll keep it as long as we can. The zero-turn lawnmower, $16,000.
Snowblower.
Scott doesn't want to give up the summer just yet. So based on equipment scoring, that is up for renewal for 2020, and that keeps us with a good fleet of lawnmowers for our campgrounds in our areas. In terms of other capital costs for 2020, the Dalewood Dam, this really, the $65,000 right now is really a placeholder. We need to wait to hear what that Dalewood Dam hazard classification report, we'll hopefully have that to you in December. That $65,000 is based on the report that we got 2 years ago now in terms of some of the replacements and stuff that we have to do. The Dalewood hazard classification will tell us, give us more information in terms of how much and how fast we need to do those. But I've placed that 65 in as a placeholder. It's also a placeholder because pending, we can always apply for additional funding through the WECI as long as the WECI stays in place. So we'll hope that the province sees the benefit of that program. And that's a 50-50 cost share. The Wi-Fi towers at the park, we've had previous reports to the board on this, and we'll finalize it before undertaking it, but basically we need $12,000 to put towers at the campgrounds to give us Wi-Fi. at the campgrounds, which is a revenue generating opportunity, but also a connectivity between the work sites. And the pooled assets and the computers are a standing item in each year. We allocate that much money just to make sure that those assets aren't falling behind and we're annually renewing into them. So the total cost for the 5-year capital for 2020 is $140,000. Again, in terms of looking and projecting ahead over the next 5 years, we've really scaled the capital plan to need. They will be modified in coming years based on the input of the annual vehicle and equipment scoring. So you'll see each new budget year will refine those projections. But without substantially increasing revenue to the reserves, we would not be able to look at this $1 million build even by 2024. That's just not in the budget. But we could probably undertake a substantially less renovation within that time frame. But I need to put some more homework into looking at those numbers because before I can slot it into that 5-year cycle.
Question, please.
Go ahead, Linda.
So on the capital piece, have we ever done a capital fundraising piece back to the community to see if there was any interest in starting something like that? I could see the new building and a few of these other parts and pieces that maybe the community might be quite interested in helping us fund. Has any thought been given to that, Elizabeth?
No, we've never done a capital request of the public. I think from the other hat that I hold in terms of looking after the environmental trust, they're really concentrating and advocating program funding. I think they're gearing up to support this authority over the next 5 years in that, seeing that we might need that type of support. I think as a board and staff, we really have to look at what is the need for a building moving forward. I mean, the board directed staff to look at that office assessment based on how the building was being used or looking at being used at the time. And an inadequacy of the boardroom, I really believe, in terms of accommodating public attendance at our meetings. And so I think that we have to look, when we're faced with the economics that we have now, I think we have to look at balancing what is the actual need of the building and the economics. And you can't see today, Linda, but the staff have added a separate screen in the boardroom, just based on some of the discussions we've had as a staff following board meetings. And we've cut down the table footprint as well of the board table, which has allowed us to put staff members at the far end of the, I guess I would say, public gallery, which has created more space for board members, and I think a more adequate viewing capability both for guests and board members in terms of having a screen right behind where I'm usually, and the chair is usually sitting. And so with staff, I've tried to work out capabilities of, again, looking at the office, what are we identified as our issues, and how can we accommodate that within our economic means at the time. I appreciate your support for looking at a capital build, but I just don't think that the public will would be there for a capital build at this time when we're going out and asking them to support our programs and services too.
I can appreciate that. I think there is only so much longevity in the building that we currently have. And I do see, you know, at some point in time, this has to be a much more serious discussion, because we either want to outgrow it, or two, we start to put too much into the maintenance of it. So it is something I think in the next 5 to 10 years we need to be very serious about looking at maybe a capital program. So those are my thoughts, Chair. I don't want it to slide off the list without each year sort of looking at where are we with this building and how much is it still delivering what it possibly can to the conservation area. So, you know, at some point in time, a capital build program takes a number of years. So if you know, we're looking 5 to 10 years out, it may be something that we have to start not too awful long from now. So just a thought.
Okay, thank you, Linda. Great.
And I guess further to Linda's comments with regards to a new build or whatever we do, this really should be a discussion with Catfish Creek at the same time. And that's the reality. Their buildings are in worse shape than ours, much worse. And I'm sure they must be having to have these same discussions, and it seems silly to be putting up 2 buildings. It should be just 1, in my opinion.
Joe, you had a question?
Yeah, no, I have another comment. First of all, we're still waiting for some more information. This is about a 3 or 4 year out, but I agree with Linda, you don't do that in the 4th year. You do it now or start planning it. But if we looked at a built-to-suit situation, instead of us carrying the capital, I recognize at the end, we don't end up owning the building, but it may fit exactly the same cost model we have, but we don't have to put up $1 million to begin with. So it may be another thing we look at is, and I like what Grant just said, because maybe the 2 of us are looking at it together, and it's a builder who's happy to build for us and lease it back to us.
Ralph?
Just a quick question to Joe with regard to the vehicle and equipment replacement. Have you ever considered leasing vehicles? I know a lot of government departments lease hundreds of pickup trucks every year. Is this something that's been looked at? Is it? I don't think it's economically viable, but have you investigated it?
Through you, Mr. Chair, to Ralph, we have in the past, during our high pressure times like tree planting and getting our seasonal staff and campgrounds up, we used to rent a vehicle for 6 months to get us through that period. What we've realized, and that's part of the reason why we're asking to keep that 2004 F-150, because it's much lower cost for us to keep that than to lease a vehicle for that time frame. The other aspect is the last few years, Scott's been successful in working with some of the dealerships on tying our truck fleet in with other like provincial purchases. So we're getting a very excellent price on the fleet trucks that we purchase. So the long run is we find it is cheaper to purchase those trucks out.
Very good, excellent, thank you. Any other comments? Oh, Allison, sorry.
Like I know the political climate is not good for putting a new building right now, and I know that it's cramped downstairs. I think this suggestion of insulating the walls sounds like a very good, to make it bearable for the people that are down there. And I don't want to be repetitive, but I think we had talked about this before, is would the boardroom serve as offices if needed, and then held the board meetings elsewhere? I know it's inconvenient for staff and to bring everything there, but at some point, if you're bursting at the seams and it's not good down there, that might be something that gets us through.
Mr. Chair, after the last meeting, I did reach out to Julie Gagnon over at the County of Elgin. She seemed receptive. She had to check scheduling, and then we haven't.
2 ships that passed in the night.
Yeah, we haven't touched base, but there's always that opportunity as well.
Okay, any other comments, questions? Excellent, so we have a motion here on the table. The KCCA vehicle and equipment replacement scoring be approved as presented, and that the 5-year capital projections be incorporated into the draft 2020-2023 budget.
I'll move.
Linda's moved it, Ralph has seconded it. All in favor? Carried. Excellent, thank you.
Mr. Chair, so the next item is really to take you through a 3% versus 2% scenario. The draft budget, I'm kind of, again, melding all of A, B, C, and D into one mass presentation on the budget, so stop me if you have any questions. Basically, the budget that went out in the advance package is based on the strategic work plans that you reviewed and accepted in June. The original budget projection that we were looking at the beginning of the summer was 3% in 2020 and 5% from 21 to 23. The fully costed budget that you have in your package is basically moving down to 3% across the board. So getting away from the 5% projected out and looking at a straight 3% over the next 4 years. The work plans that you reviewed in June really have been scaled back to meet those budget targets and incorporated cost-saving measures and revenue-generating initiatives as outlined in the September report that you've looked at. For discussion purposes, I also included a 2% scenario, but that was just for 2020. The other 4 years were not costed out at that level. Surprisingly, it's a ripple effect, right? So until we get there, I didn't want to show you all those numbers, plus it's a lot of numbers to look at. Cost pressures and uncertainty. So we've been through this a lot. We have the loss of the natural hazards transfer payment. We have confirmed a loss of the low water response program. That email was sent out in your advanced packages. Jen will have a full report at the next board meeting in terms of what that means for her program area, but we can confirm we've lost that $4,000. We continue to have uncertainty of source water protection and how that will impact how we are levied for source water protection and whether or not that levy will go down to the municipalities rather than right now it's a funding grant goes to the grant and then that's disseminated out to the other CAs for source water protection. That might change in the future. And we have pressure for updated floodplain mapping and continued online services. The annual average increase target for the City of London for boards and commissions was 1.5%. And if you listen to the news, this week only 3 of 14 boards and commissions met that target. Sorry. So the report that went to City of London Council this week, only 3 of 14 met that initial submission guideline. Met that guideline with their initial submission. And obviously we didn't meet it either. We're sitting at 4% for an average annual increase. However, this was our August submission to the City of London, and you remember that in 2020 they over budgeted us in 2019, so the actual increase in 2020 for ours is less for them. But in terms of your municipalities, you're still looking at a 3%. So this is how they came up with the 4% annual average. It's 1% to them in 2020, 5% the years after is 4%. The scenario that I have in front of you today for the 3% actually brings down the London target to 2.5%. So I got an email yesterday from City of London staff saying boards and commissions are being asked to resubmit business cases to bring their target down. If I submit the budget that's in front of you today, I've brought the target for the City of London down from 4% to 2.5%. So just 1% higher than their target that they're asking us to meet. What you also have in your package today is the 2% scenario for the City of London. That would mean a 2020 increase of just 0.2%. And to meet that 1.5% target for them, we would be looking at reducing our levy for those all 4 years to 2%. Does that make sense for everyone? So the scenario you're looking at today for your municipalities and an average, the levy increase for Kettle would be 3, 3, 3, and 3. That would bring us to a London target of 2.5. The 2% scenario that we're looking at today, I would have to bring each of the 4 years to 2% to meet the London target of 1.5%. Okay? So there's a difference between a 3% levy increase in 2020 and a 2% levy increase of about roughly $10,000. And I've not fully costed this scenario out, but it would basically mean we need to file find another $10,000 each year to meet that target.
Okay, Grant, you had a question?
Well, obviously, you have to find that money. At that level, are you able to maintain all the services that we're required to do with the staffing you have?
At the 2%, at the 3% I've costed out, I'm comfortable with that. The 2%, I have to find another 10,000 this year. I can find that this year. I have that's proposals in this package. I haven't costed out what that means for the next 4 years, but roughly would mean me finding, it's a ripple effect. You need to find 10%, roughly $10,000 in each one of those years. Without really impacting programs and services more, it would basically, the easy fix would be to look at the campgrounds. But it has a ripple effect. You can pass that off to the campgrounds, but you're probably putting $10,000 less to your reserves at the end of the year to keep your infrastructure up, right? Without further impacting any other programs and services, or relying more on your reserves in the hope that staff can pull off funding programs and funding proposals in year that don't require that drawdown on reserves at the end of the year.
But eventually, that comes back to bite you.
Eventually, you know, it could catch up to us, yes.
Dennis?
Elizabeth, could you clarify how the 1% is arrived at and how that affects our local levies?
So it doesn't affect, yeah, it's confusing. Normally, it's not like this. Normally, it would be a 3% across the board or 2% across the board. But in 2019, the City of London minimum wage was set to increase. And that happened after all the boards and commissions put their budgets in. And without going back to each of the boards and commissions, the City of London said, we're going to give every board and commission, we're going to budget an extra 10, I guess for us it would have been about $10,000 to cover off any increases they might have for minimum wage. We never went back to our municipalities to ask for any more funds to cover off minimum wage. We covered it off on our own in the campgrounds. But the City of London doesn't take that, they already allocated that money to Kettle Creek, so they didn't take it out of their budget. It's still sitting there, it just looks like we came under for 2019. So they've already budgeted that, they haven't moved away from it. So according to them, I've spent that money, or they've already allocated that money to us in their budget. So my increase, my 3% increase for general levy, half of it they've already accounted for, they've already budgeted in the year prior.
Thank you.
It's, I know it's confusing,
Well, I'm still reasonably new, so I'm going to ask, might be the stupid question. The province has cut us by about $64,000, $60,000 of it almost in a category called natural hazard transfer payment. What was it supposed to pay for, and have we cut $60,000 out of those departments?
yes.
Okay.
So, well, what we did, we didn't necessarily, we have to do the programs and services that natural hazards program did. So that's your flood forecasting, that's your dam maintenance.
Okay, they're telling you we're giving you less money to do it, so if
We're
we
giving
cut
you
that
less money.
percentage out of those programs.
No, what
No.
we did is we lost our GIS.
Now, I know that's how we recovered the
We covered it,
60,000, I
yeah.
know the board was here, we made that decision.
Yeah,
But I guess what I'm asking, if the province is very clearly saying, here's where you should spend less, are we spending less? Because I give them what they're asking to buy, right? They're asking to buy $60,000 less in that department, right? I mean, that was clear, that's what they said for you to take it out of. We in fact took it out of GIS, which was very useful for us, and I get that, and at the time, it was an easy way. I guess I'm asking is, are we the only CA doing it this way, balancing across, trying to do everything we were doing when the province has said, no, you're getting 60,000 less to do that portion of jobs? Or should we be taking it out of that portion of jobs?
I guess the province took the money away, they didn't direct us to do less in terms of their mandated, we're legislated to have flood forecasting, we're legislated to have those STAMP programs. I feel compromised as a staff
Give them
member if you're
60,000 less of
saying.
that value, I guess. That's just what
How do you do
it
that?
puzzles me.
I don't know how you can do that, though, Joe, it's all or nothing. All the province said was, we're gonna decrease our share of what we're paying for, right? But we're not decreasing your responsibility. A flood's a flood, and flood forecasting is flood forecasting. You can't go, well, it's a Tuesday, so we're not doing it today, right?
I understand, that's why I said I may be asking a stupid question. Maybe it's not separate.
No questions.
But the funder in this case is saying, this is where we're taking your money. I'd like to return the results to the funder to say, thank you very much. Then we've reduced our performance in those categories.
To follow up on that, where else could the province have taken their money other than out of that category?
That's all they fund.
Right.
So therefore.
And they're not funding, they never were funding it 100%.
Okay.
Not even.
Right.
So what you're saying is what's good for the goose is good for the gander. You're gonna take your money away, then we're gonna give you less.
At least show you, I mean, look, if somebody comes into my Wendy's and says, hey, I want to spend less money, well, then you're going to get smaller fries. I mean, if government's saying, I want to spend less money on natural hazard transfer payment, I'm going to deliver them less performance on natural hazard transfers. I would think that would be the most common. Am I being too simplistic? I don't know.
I don't,
Yeah.
I hear what Joe's saying. I guess from a liability perspective,
Well, I know
Does
who would
this-
own the liability, the person who took the money away, not the person who didn't deliver.
No, because they're gonna say you should have increased your levy to cover it.
or I think what they're getting
They're not
at
saying
is
that. They're
concentrate
clearly
on,
not saying that.
take money from what they are considering non-core and put it back into the core.
Okay? You
Which
can't
is
find
what
that.
which is what we did.
Great.
So we stop fixing the dam?
I'm not suggesting that, I'm just
That
suggesting,
is where most of the
is
money goes.
it recordable? Is it something we can say, that's why we quit doing what you're asking? Because you gave us less money to do it.
I think if you took a look at the shock of all the CAs province-wide, when they lost that funding, they all kind of said the same thing, well, you're taking money, but you're not asking us to do anything else, or anything less. I think that's, so bottom line is,
Yeah, it just
you
seems
still
obvious
have
to
to
me
drive
that
to
that's
St.
what I
Thomas,
was
but
doing.
you have to walk the last half, like it's just,
Okay.
yeah. I understand what you're saying as well, I
Yeah.
think that is a good point, but perhaps that point needs to be raised at a different table.
Well, and it really should be,
Yes.
we can get there too, but
Yes.
that's, sorry, this is what we can deliver with what you're funding. I mean, I can only do so much. Okay.
Okay. Any other questions, by the way? No.
And Mr. Chair, I guess I don't like the idea of, you kind of commented that, we can make it happen, but the campgrounds will suffer at the end, won't be as much going to the church. So it's save money now, pay later kind of thing. And then also don't like the idea of staff having to go out and find yet another $10,000, because I think they're working hard now to make partnerships and raise money and stuff, and yet there's another $10,000 you gotta go. So, how much more staff time is that gonna take and pressure to do the things you're already doing? So, yeah, I just don't know. Yeah, I don't like that at all, that 2% thing for what it's gonna give us in the end.
Can I? Yeah, sure.
So, no answer first, and then I'll ask.
I think if I go through the whole presentation, like we've kind of got hung up on that, but if I can show you the difference between 3 and 2, then,
See, that's why I didn't ask my question. Okay.
But I'm going to have to leave shortly, and I know your whole presentation, I've read through it. I guess my point is still going to be, but I'm not going to pay the province's bills. If the province wants to take $64,000 from this organization, it doesn't go to the taxpayer of St. Thomas. That we're willing to pay our normal participating rate of levy, and we're saying we're going to tax our citizens this year an increase of about 2%. And I know none of them would put their hand up and say, let's make that higher, right? So I want to be on record as saying, I understand the scenarios and how hard it is, but I'm not going to pay the province's bills. and we've had a number of municipality meetings where that's exactly what's been said. Thank you, if you want to cut the money to the CAs or to the health units or to the ambulance, fine, but we're not going to pick up the difference as municipalities beyond the normal cost of living increase to what we normally do. And at the end of the day, you're going to see a reduction in service. If that's what you're looking for, then that's what you're funding, right? Yeah. I don't want a reduction in service at Kettle Creek. I don't want a reduction in service, but I don't want to pay, I'm not going to tomorrow start paying 10% of the hospital. Because healthcare is a provincial issue. Well, because conservation authorities truly are too. So, but that's what we're trying to say. As my municipality has been very clear, and other neighboring municipalities have been very clear. We're trying to set a limit so we can say to the province, this is about right, and we've picked 2% as a, gee, we'd sure like to be there, we can afford that, our taxpayers can afford that as a tax increase, but we can't pay the province's bills. I understand downloading, but we're not gonna let it be a download. So, right? Or don't want it to be, or when we'll be quite clear about it, so. I get it, Bill, I understand when I don't use the maintenance contract on the refrigeration and air conditioning units in years subsequent, I've got higher bills, but if I'm faced in my business with less income this year, I've got to find a way to not spend, right? Like my household the same way, I got to go without the new car this year because we're at that point. We're just going to have to face the next couple of years of being pretty austere. I don't think we're at the end of this yet either, so. We're going to find a way to do it with less. I just wanted to make this.
And I appreciate that, and I understand that you're gonna have to leave, so go on with your presentation, and then maybe that will clarify it for people.
I hope so.
Yeah. Well, no, yeah.
I don't know if we're ever gonna get past what Joe is identifying
Right.
there. I think that from a staff level, what I'm presenting to you today, I've pared back everything I can. Those
Right.
strategic plans that we presented in June,
Mhm.
this budget doesn't deliver them. Unless I can
Right.
find the funding outside of the municipal levy, right?
And I guess
What this does is basically status quo, keeps us, I believe, doing the programs and services that we're legislated to do.
Right. And I'm not disagreeing
Yeah.
that this is at best status quo, it's probably an erosion of status quo.
Yeah.
But that's what we're now being funded for. The pool now is this big. So is there, of the strategic plans we said yes to in June, which one of them was the least important? And the boards need to make tough decisions like that. Is there something else we shouldn't be doing that we're currently doing? Is there another way to find the 1% that would carry us through? That I can only throw that up. I don't do your day-to-day job, and you do it magnificently, and you would know better if there was, well, okay, let's just tell the province we can't do this, right? And we won't do it anymore.
And
That's my
that
thought.
is coming, like that low water response, that's
Right.
the draft report that Jen's working on now. The province has taken away $4,000,
Yep.
but they said, hey, if you want to still give us that information, we'd love to have it.
Right, of course. Right.
So the report that's going to you
You're right.
in a couple of weeks is, we're not giving it.
No,
So
well,
that-
it's the same with my
we won't
police
provide it.
force.
Why- why
Here's the
should we
budget
continue
they're
to do
asking
that?
for, and if I don't give it to them, I get one less officer, but I'm okay if he still comes to work. I get it, I get the thinking, that's not, but as a business person, I look at, here's the income for next year. What are the most important things I have to do with that income? And just, I really still want to build something else, but I just can't. It runs out at this line, so. Right. Anyway, I must leave. I have to go judge soup. I know that sounds less important than this budget, but I'll give them my thoughts.
Next.
Thanks, Joe.
Take another sample for us, Joe.
Oh, no, it'll be on my shirt.
So your levy projections and what it means to each one of your member municipalities was also included in the advanced packages. And you can see on the screen what increase it would need for your municipality, 3% versus 2%, and the difference between what you're paying in 2019 and in 2020. So, for the increases of between 2%, 3%, for some is less than $100. between those two scenarios. Revenue generating, that's been incorporated into the budget to keep these numbers to get these numbers to where I'm presenting them today. Over-counter tree sale costs increasing from 25 cents to 50 cents. Campground revenues have increased slightly, but it's a mix of fees and potentially adding more seasonal sites at Dalewood. Revenue generating opportunities, Wi-Fi in the campgrounds to at least offset our internet and costs. The reserve funds are being pulled from to support stewardship, forest and lands, water and conservation. Reserve funds are helping to contain the levy to support tree planting. So if you look at that line item within your budget, we're basically staying at the same levy going in that program from 2019 to 2020. We're just relying on reserves instead. And reserve funds are supporting the invasive species program that's also being supported by outside funding. Cost savings, we went through the cost of living wage changes limited to 1.9. We're self-insuring ourselves now in short-term disability to save money there. We've cut a full-time employee. The cameras and rain gauges that were outlined in the work plans have now been self-funded. The staff found money for that. We're limiting that to just what we can put on that funding proposal. And we're looking at shared services to be initiated to keep GIS and drone services at the authority. In terms of delay, if you look at those work plans, a lot of the things that we have planned over the next 4 years have been delayed. So there's no additional environmental monitoring sites being added. The paperless accounting, scheduling, and timesheets have been put on hold. That simply can't be put in the budget. There's no additional trail development, so this has been something that the public's been asking for a number of years in terms of mountain biking, but we don't have funds to put towards trail development, certainly not to hiring any staff on to help maintain them. Cost pressures we've went through and of course still sit there with a lot of unknowns, so that makes it very difficult to cost out those final 4 years. The reserves, in terms of what we're pulling from reserves, we've got $20,000 coming from the legal reserve. The wage subsidy reserve is almost subsidizing $30,000 in wages. Sub-watershed, $20,000 going to tree planting. Conservation Lands Reserve is supporting any invasive species control we want to conduct on our lands. And there's the standard $12,000 coming over to support the Kettle Creek Clean Water Initiative, and that's on the ground works. Our capital reserves we went through is $140,000 to support those projects there. And budgeted within these scenarios is about $43,000 per year from the campgrounds being reinvested into the infrastructure to make sure that we can fulfill the requirements there. So what's the main difference between the 3% and 2%? Both are really status quo programs and services. We're not adding anything, we're deleting things, we're delaying things. The 3%, however, would allow small incremental improvements in the natural hazard management program. So basically, we need to acquire, as all your municipalities are probably looking at, the swoop comes out in 2020, we need to acquire our portion of that. A 3% would allow us to begin work towards updating floodplain mapping by concentrating on flood damage centers and surveying some bridges and looking at inundation mapping. So inundation mapping is basically showing us where floodwaters hit within our flood damage centers for different storm events. So we know exactly where the flood damage center water lies for the 2-year storm, the 5-year storm, 100, and that allows us to help be better managers. The 2%, what would basically happen, or what I'm proposing, is that if we drop to 2% in 2020, we would just be able to acquire the swoop, and all of this work would be put on hold. We wouldn't be able to pursue even an incremental development of that area. And again, there's about a $10,000 difference between that. Joe, I don't know if you can pull up the example. Joe, so the inundation mapping that we're looking at, we're going to receive inundation mapping as a result of the dam hazard classification for the damage centers, mainly in St. Thomas, out of that report. And the ability, what Joe's going to show you is what we would be able to start working towards with that $10,000 for other flood damage centers throughout the watershed. So Joe, I'll just let you explain that.
Thank you. So what I'm going to show you here, and the consultant did ask that you emphasize this is preliminary data that's coming as part of that dam risk assessment. There's still more work to do. It's subject to change. But we thought it would be important to see the benefits of what we can get out of the floodplain mapping. The other thing I'll note is the software that we're using on the computers in the boardroom is a little outdated, so there's more capabilities we can do with these mapping layers, because they do come in a 3D model where we can project cross sections and actually see flood depths and things like that. Historically, with our floodplain mapping, it's always been done for the purposes of the regulation, which is the extent of the regional storm, which is Hurricane Hazel. So we've always had floodplain lines that show us the extent of the regional storm, but we haven't been able to see the different series of flood standards within it. So in this case, what we're actually looking at is Parkin Street, which is just outside of the city limits within the municipality of Central Elgin, and it's one of our flood damage centers that tends to flood residential development areas early in the process, or first. So by going through this, what we can see is, here's an example of a 1 and 2 year flood. So the lighter gray basically shows the channel of Kettle Creek, and the black areas, as you can see, the lower lying lands that start to flood with a 1 to 2 year storm, a 1 to 10 year storm, 1 to 25, 1 to 50, 1 to 100, and then the regional storm. So we can actually see the progression of flooding as it goes out. The interesting fact that kind of really had some interest to staff when we were looking at this, and I don't remember the last year flood that we had, I don't remember the dates, but the last time we had a pretty serious flood where the flood levels were high, it was reaching residential development, the old Dalewood Bailey Bridge was at risk. We actually can confirm that we saw water levels on this road approximately this location. So we now know that that flood event that year was roughly between a 1 in 50 and a 1 in 100 year storm equivalent event that occurred, and we were able to see it. The other benefit with these more 3D models, for one example I can show, is I can now go in and see what the flood depths would be in approximate location. So approximately 2.7 meters of flood depth would be through this area as a result of a regional storm.
But Joe, what about erosion over on that left side, where there's obviously a fairly steep bank up to a road?
Correct?
Is that not an issue?
In what context?
Okay,
Like, there's a slope here.
yes, but then particularly right there, no. Okay,
So he's talking about the residential road on the left.
the residential road.
Oh, right here.
Yes, that's a steep bank, obviously, down there to the water level.
Right, absolutely, and there's a significant force of water that's hitting the toe of that bank. And you can see hysterically that we did have the oxbow that was created and cut off.
Exactly. And when you look at all the erosion that's occurred in Lake Erie this year,
Right.
on waterfront properties.
So by giving the better inundation mapping, these are producing it based on more accurate surveys, more accurate data that's going into it, and we're able to define the series of the inundation mapping for a couple reasons. Is it's helping us with determining what level of storm events we're seeing in the watershed, as well as it's giving us more data and information to assist us in decision making when we're looking at our regulatory rules that are there.
So in a more rural setting, we have hazard areas, low-lying areas. Obviously, the same technology is at play. So how are you accessing more accurate? Is it just satellite, or are you using municipal drain mapping, or?
So right now, my understanding of how this is being produced is the province, in I believe 2013, acquired LiDAR mapping, the the full background understanding. Typically, when we fly aerial photography, it's a plane with a camera taking a series of shots. LiDAR has a laser measurement that's constantly reading, so it's not necessarily survey accurate, but it's as close as we can possibly get without spending the costs of going out and surveying everything. And the province has produced a 3D model, and that's available publicly, and that sets the base of the topographic mapping they use to run the models. Part of the biggest expense, that saves a huge expense in producing floodplain mapping by using that LiDAR map, by using that LiDAR base. Where the majority of the expense goes is the next step is this, they have to go out and survey every crossing to determine the capacity that bridges and culverts and everything else follow through. And that would be the significant portion of the cost. Once they do those surveys, they then embed it into that LiDAR mapping to bring it more accurate, up to date, and then they can run these different scenarios based on the storm standards. So historically, the authority has made the decision that in our flood damage centers, so this stretch of St. Thomas from the Dalewood Dam down to the sewage treatment plant is one of our high priority areas. We have very detailed mapping that we can produce that higher accuracy for not a huge nominal cost. The other area we can look at is Port Stanley for that. What they've done for the rural areas is more of an estimated flood, but not going to the full detail of surveying every bridge, but still relying on the topographic data. So really what we've done in the past, because of a cost issue, is higher engineered flood mapping in the flood damage centers and more of a rural estimated flood in the rural areas. But still much better accuracy, what we can do today with that LiDAR mapping than what's been done historically when we did our mapping, because whatever the best information was at the time, it's just improved that much more over the last 20 years.
Any other questions at all?
So basically, that's where I would find the $10,000 to take you from a 3% to a 2%. Either we agree that that's a priority that we want to take on in 2020. It would allow us to make incremental advancements on our floodplain mapping rather than leaving it. We're seeing big benefits from that information that we've got out of the dam hazard classification. And $10,000 would allow us to kind of continue that work throughout the watershed and choose another damage center to take a look at. So with the loss of that, then basically at 2%, you're just looking at the swoop acquisition. So basically what I need today is in terms of consideration between moving from that 3% to 2%. All the strategic planning priorities have been delayed except for those natural hazard management things that we feel would be appropriate at this time. And again, even those are scaled. The reserves are being utilized but should not be exhausted to continue to contain levy in the future. The campgrounds are a main source of funding. Again, they help to contain levy increases, but only they can take so much pressure. And basically what I would like to do is arrive at some sort of decision today between the 3 and 2% that will allow me to appropriately respond back to the City of London, but as well, if you so desire, to take out our budget presentation to your member municipalities following the November 20th meeting to see if they have any questions on our budget before the February meeting.
Great.
I guess further to Joe's presentation, so with the county going through the whole natural hazard right now that Upper Thames created for us, I guess, it's hard to do. Are you able to piggyback on that? Is that separate from what you're trying to do? Or?
If I understand correctly, I think what project you're speaking of that the Upper Thames is doing for the county is a natural heritage system study. So it's more focusing on flora and fauna, not necessarily a hazardous management component. So it's a different study.
Bill.
You were sure, Elizabeth, I can't remember exactly what you were talking about, the trust fund. The money the trust fund gives the authority, is that kind of built into the budget, or is that a donation kind of thing set aside?
No, the trust, the trust will yearly, we've gotten to a point with the trust that they have now been able to allocate a yearly kind of funds to the authority. Those have been built into this budget specifically for the invasive species program. But but they're also supporting a little bit of the public relations as well.
Yeah, as far as dealing with the City of London, like, the County of Middlesex right now is going through it with the land ambulance discussion, because their interpretation of the numbers are very different from what the County of Middlesex's interpretation of the numbers are. And our budget for that is based on a service agreement that is with the City of London. It's not, we're throwing some numbers together, it's based in the agreement they've signed. Do we have any different agreements in place? How do our services work? Like, do we have things that we've already committed to numbers, or?
Yeah, no, there's no service agreement with the City of London. It's basically the same as your member municipalities, but they do have a more robust budget request. So you'll see from, in I think it was September, October, I included in the budget, you have to do a business plan, put your numbers in, those types of things. So I've did a little bit of reading on the land ambulance, but I don't think that there's any skewing of our numbers in the way that we've had to present them to the city.
Any other questions? Dominic?
Just going back to the floodplain mapping, I'm just curious, who else has an interest in that information? Who needs this information?
I think there's a lot, there'd probably be, Mr. Chair, there'd be a lot of interest in the information. The province is really moving for us now to offer up that type of floodplain mapping to the public through online services. So I think the biggest thing that Joe would comment on right now is people buy houses. They don't get their real estate agent to do their homework and come to the authority and ask, am I in a floodplain? So there's a big push both on the province as well as Conservation Ontario for us to get some of that mapping up online so that people can do it for themselves and they can see where they are in the floodplain. It's useful for us in terms of flood forecasting so that we know roughly. What we've got excited about this inundation mapping is that it's aligning well with what we have seen on the ground. Right, so to be able to say, call the municipality in those situations and say, we're now looking at a 2-year flood. This is where we project the water levels are to be. These are the houses that you need to call. Without that, we're just kind of feeling, to be honest, we're feeling our way through that with the municipalities. So I think it's a benefit for our staff in terms of flood forecasting. It's a benefit in terms of the public, in terms of making informed decisions about where they're living and choosing to live. And it's a big benefit for municipal staff in terms of emergency planning as well.
Just as a follow-up, Mr. Chair, because so I see a source of revenue in terms of whether it's insurance companies or real estate agents or even property owners. I see a fee for service here, potential, where I'd say whoever has a keen interest in obtaining that information, I don't think it has to be free. I think it's worth a lot. And so I just see a potential, and even a partner. I think it was at AMO, there was a whole session from insurance companies who are really interested in this information and who may be a partner and a funder. And so.
Has the horse been let out of the barn there though? Is
free
is it free online now? So could you ever pull that back in to charge for it?
Do you want to comment on
With
that?
this level of detail?
There's, I think the only thing I can really comment on, they don't have a lot of expertise with, is Land Information Ontario is a provincial agency that's collecting similar data and offering it free publicly out there. There may be a revenue stream through the development community that need this information to assist with addressing the issues or assessing it. Currently, we've just given it as free information to help through the process, but that may be one avenue that way. But a lot of the information is available through the province, through that Land Information Ontario site.
So if it's available, do we need to duplicate it then?
In terms of available, it's as it's developed, right? So if there's floodplain mapping on there, and I'm not positive if the flood mapping is on there that we produced, but this would certainly be a higher level of detail and information than what's currently out there.
So it is a value add, so potential.
And I don't disagree with that. The problem I see is, you look around the table and the 2 or 3 municipalities that will affect most is St. Thomas, Central Elgin, a little bit of Southwold maybe. And so you're gonna charge those municipalities for the service, or developers within the municipality, or working in the municipality. It's just a vicious circle. It's still, you know, whether we take it off the levy or we do a fee, which takes more staff time as well, when you start billing people. And it just seems to be a bit of a vicious circle unless you're targeting the developers personally.
Municipal cannibalism, is that what you're talking about?
I understand what Joe's saying, Mayor Preston. With just not doing it and telling the province we aren't going to do it, here you go. But when they first started reducing transfer payments back, Dennis probably remembered 10 years ago or so, and the drastic changes, and some municipalities said, well, we're just going to status quo and we'll fix the problem, so that it happened to reimburse us. Well, that didn't happen. So to say to the province, well, we're here you go. We're going to reduce it. We're not going to fix it dam. We aren't going to notify people when their houses are going to be flooded. That could come back and bite us as well. You know, it's a very slippery slope when you start going down that road.
Bill?
Could you put the chart back up there that shows the 2% versus 3% and the differences between all the municipalities? Yes, I know, and it doesn't matter what municipality, like, it's an all or nothing vote, like when it comes to the vote and the budget and all that, and we're not talking hundreds of thousands of dollars. If someone was adamant that I want 2%, that's it, is there the option to say we can do 2% for, let's say, Central Elgin, but this is what you sacrifice. This is like, you know, that's like taking a pie and cutting it all up, I know that, but is there something that a service someone could sacrifice? And that's almost getting down to contract servicing that we were talking about at the start, but, you know, if someone's adamant that I want 2% and my municipality doesn't want to pay no more 2%, is there the option to say, okay, that's fine, but you're sacrificing this services, it would cost this much for you to, this is what you're going to get less by doing the 2%. Is that even possible, or is that just starting a whole
Can of worms.
That's a big can of worms.
Yeah.
I think if you're looking at that, I mean, that's possibly what the province is moving to in terms of those service agreements. But it does erode the watershed, the integrated watershed management aspect of how we operate now. In the past, this authority hasn't really got into it, but there's things like special levy. So if you wanted to look at, say, the floodplain mapping, we could say to the city of St. Thomas, well, you have the most benefit from that floodplain mapping if we're going to do your damage centers. So here's a special levy to you to undertake that mapping, and this is your portion of that special levy. Or say if it was Central Elgin, the next flood damage center we wanted to do was Port Stanley, they would say, well, really you're getting 100% of that benefit, and then we would put that special levy on that because they're getting that benefit, and the full cost would go to them. I see that as a better way to go than to the way you're suggesting probably erodes it more, rather than identifying who's the benefiting municipalities and charging them.
But does that leave an opt-out or not?
It leaves an opt-out for that municipality. That municipality would then say, no, I don't agree, that's not a benefit that my municipality wants to undertake now. And I believe, I'd have to go back to the regulation and look at special levies, I believe that they could possibly decline that, but again, don't quote me on it, I'd have to go back
But
and
we would
look
still
at.
assume the cost.
We would do the work,
Right.
we would do the work, but there would be an extra, like a $10,000 levy to Central Elgin, because we've determined as a board that the majority of the benefit is to that municipality.
We'll say in this one, like this takes Central, we're talking $700. So if you take it on a year by year, and if there's an issue between that 1%, like, is the municipality willing to give something up for $700 to stick to that 2%? You know what I'm saying? I don't know, it's extra work and all that, it's away from what we normally do. I don't know.
Thoughts? Joe?
If I may, just on that topic in relation to the floodplain mapping, I think the scary road we're going down to in that type of avenue is that we're missing pieces. We may end up missing pieces of the puzzle. So realizing that what happens upstream affects landowners downstream, and if we get into that type of processes where some municipalities may say, well, I don't need the floodplain mapping, that's dropped through 1%, that's information that feeds into the floodplain mapping in other areas that then is missing, or we have to find ways
And it
to.
might not be just something that important as the floodplain mapping that affects everybody. It could be some small service that's worth $1,000 that somebody said, you know what, for this year, we're gonna have to pass that by because we want to stick to this, I don't know.
Dennis, did you have a question?
Yeah, just going back to the overall budget. The 3% is 29,000 that you're showing on there. And there was 28,000 taken out of reserves for funding for wages. It's odd that we're moving from reserves to meet our 3% budget on wages. It's something we shouldn't be doing. That's going back to what Mayor Preston said earlier. We're not providing less services. The service levels is remaining the same. I got an issue right now with that, taking money out of reserves to fund wages. And how many years in a row can we do this? I know it's something that can't be done in perpetuity, so we gotta have a better message to the province, or is it time to start talking amalgamation with other conservations?
It was discussed a couple of weeks ago.
For me, what your comment, that's a very valid comment. But on the other hand, has there ever been a more uncertain time in this whole business than right now?
Mm-hmm.
And so you want to be careful that you don't react, but rather be proactive in how you're doing. And so, to me, using that wage reserve is a way of ensuring that we have one more year to deal with these changes before, because as you looked at the chart that you talked about with the mapping, right? And you say, we can leave it and then wait for regulations. When then they come out and say, you have to do it, and by the way, we're not gonna pay for it, right? So this way, we have maintained a little bit more control over what we're doing, in the hopes that the government is going to shake their heads and go, oh, maybe we need to enhance this or enhance that. As opposed to being reactive and going, oh my God, we gotta give up, right?
But on top of that, and even with the city of London coming and saying they want the 1.5% across for every board they deal with, the conservation board hits hardest out of all those boards, Lake Haven does. So for them to say 1.5, that's unfair to this board.
Well, that's what that bothers me, is that the City of London is charting a course for us, and it's not necessarily the right answer. Like, I understand cutting, and I understand austerity, but I also understand that the province's will may change as well. Like, and that's all we've been seeing, is that they've come down and said, you have to do this, you have to do that, then all of a sudden they go, well, maybe you don't have to do that as much. So it's really an uncertain climate. It was like, as far as like Ultra County, they didn't know what they were doing until last week when Stephen Clark said, oh, well, we're not going to do that anymore. It's so hard.
And personally, I think that we are sitting here in a pretty good situation at this point in time. I'm sure there are other conservation authorities who are in much worse shape when they're talking about their budget. And so I think we still possess the ability to be proactive in what we're doing under the circumstances, as opposed to being reactive to what's being done to us. And, you know, maybe this time next year, we're sitting there going, oh my God, what are we gonna do, right?
Which is following. I do like the idea of the mapping, and the 3% is something that it is a supportable levy, unfortunately, looking at it, but I think we gotta start looking at different avenues at this point.
Allison?
And I think to Dominique's point of the value added of the mapping, I think, you know, we can't just sit here and go, we just have to wait. I think by doing something like this, which is not a huge cost, I think that it is important, and it is something that lets people know the value of what a conservation authority is, other than, you know, maybe we can't go camping this weekend. It's more of a business-like approach when you have insurance companies that need that information, or developers that need that information. It's being part of the solution as opposed to being part of the problem.
Dominic?
I just wanted to clarify, so we're looking for $10,000, and it feels like there's only one option on the table right now as to where that 10,000 could come from of the entire budget. So is there nothing else that could be looked at?
I really feel like there isn't. That 10,000 was the last thing that we had looked at in terms of strategic work plan priorities as an add-on to the budget, that I didn't feel comfortable taking away myself. All the other ones I took away, like the paperless work environment, those things, that's a management decision that I think I can make, that I can ask staff, you know what, we're gonna put that on the table. The hazard management thing is one of our core programs. That's the last one I did. I wanted the rain gauges and the cameras. We went out and found the money for that, for a minimum of what we could do. Improving our floodplain mapping, trying to meet the provincial goal of getting things online, are things that I think had to come to the board to make that decision. Because what I'm saying to you today is I've taken the budget down as low as I can go. There's no add-ons there. I've taken everything away. I've pulled what I'm comfortable from reserves. But this is the last thing that you can look, that this, you know, in terms of core, this is a decision that I think really has to come to you to make. You know, there's always other things I can do. Like I said, I can pull from reserves. I could pull more from campgrounds to make up that difference. But that's an erosion. This is something that, yeah, we don't need to undertake right now. As the report said, we could wait for regulation. But as a manager of this authority, I think that I need to be realistic to you to say the budgets that I'm presenting with you are just status, like they are, like Joe said, status quo, if not eroding status quo. We're not keeping pace with our sister agencies. We're not meeting the demands that are being put on us by the province. So it's like Joe said, they're asking us to be more forthcoming with our information, get it online, update your floodplain mapping. When my funding's been cut by $60,000, I've lost a person, I've scaled every non-core program back that I can. There's not much more I can do. It's got to come back to you to say, no, we're comfortable with not making advances on our floodplain mapping because the province is putting too much pressure on us. We're going to have to wait.
Great.
I guess my personal thoughts are, we stick with the 3%. We send a letter to the Cap District and Minister Urick suggesting we sit down and talk. And maybe Mr. Urick has to be the person that facilitates that discussion. But quite frankly, if we're going to save money, it's with shared services or it doesn't have to be amalgamation. I know they're very protective of the reserves they have, and they're probably going to use their reserves for several years to get through this and not have substantial increases. My understanding is their reserves are much higher than ours, but that's my thought anyway. Use the 3% to get through this year, and then send a letter to the chair, to Minister Urick and Cap District, asking for a serious discussion on where we can save money.
Ralph, you've been pretty quiet.
Well, I know, I'm sitting, I'm listening, but I totally agree with you. I think we've got to try and hold the line, because if we cut back on flood control mapping and so on, that's a fairly significant thing that we should have available for anybody that wants information, if they're going thinking of buying property that's in floodplain land. And it's amazing the number of people that do buy property in floodplain land and then say, nobody told us it was gonna flood. And we have to say, hey, didn't you see that creek or river right out behind you? No?
Linda, do you have anything to add?
So I've been listening carefully, and I think I agree with some of the comments recently made. The ministry has to realize that if we make these cuts on these essential services, then it comes back to them as to whether or not they feel it's important. We know it's important, but they have to decide whether or not it's important enough to support. So I'm kind of coming back to His Worship's scenario there. It's a bit of a reality check for them, and I don't disagree with the comment that was just made that we need to put that in front of the minister. If you want to deal with it, yes, and if you're okay with us not doing some of these essential services, then so be it. You wear that hat, not us. So, going to the 2%, and having Elizabeth do what she said she was going to do, I'm in agreement with that. I think it's time to sort of lay it on the line. They've asked us to do that. They said, here's what we want you to do, and let them wear it. They may come back and say, you know what, these essential services are a must. Here's the funding for it. I'm not counting on that, but let's put it back in their ballpark.
Okay, anybody else? Allison, you want to say something?
I'd feel more comfortable about that if I thought they knew what the ballpark was.
Yeah.
That's the problem I have, is that it's easy to say to people, cut, but, and I don't see a lot of fat around here that can be cut without lowering services. And when you start lowering services, are you as valuable to the people you serve then? And it's like saying, let's not build that bridge this year, and we'll just keep on holding on to it for a while, and then the bridge goes. Like, you still have to have the proper services to provide people. And again, we're getting back to political decisions that are affecting flooding. We've got people, I don't know, was it wherever it was on the shorelines, flooded out 3 times this year. And then we've got the particular party that's in charge is denying any climate change. Like, I mean, I just don't understand. Like, I think it's really hard to row that line when you've got one person saying it doesn't exist and you've got other people that have been flooded out 3 times. And if there's mapping and different things that help with that, I think for what, I know for town center share, I don't have a problem with 3%.
Bill?
So are we, I forgot what the motion is. Is there a motion?
Well, we're not at a motion yet.
There's no motion.
No, so we're trying to get a sort of where we are. And to me, I'm hearing 2 different schools of thought. And that's why I wanted to hear from Linda and I wanted to hear from Ralph, because I think it's important that we recognize, we can cut back on services, and people may not even notice that we cut back on services next year, but then in 2 years or 3 years, all of a sudden it's, hey, what happened? Right? And that's why I've been trying to emphasize being proactive while we still can. Because if we don't take advantage of being proactive this year, and Dominique, I think your idea, as I've sort of ruminated on it, I think it's, value added is very, very important, and that's being almost entrepreneurial in doing that, right? So that gives a message as well. I personally, I hear both sides of the argument, and I think it's really important. This is a very important decision for us right now. And as a group, I think we need to have a full discussion. Dennis?
Just go back to Grant's suggestion about sending a letter to the minister and to Capish, promoting shared services, not the A word, but shared services. And ask for the ministry to facilitate that, because we like the idea of mapping and give the minister a reason for attending and
Having sat in the meeting with him, I'm not sure he's not up on that whole notion, right?
but having the ministry actually steer the ship on this.
I'm not sure he's gonna, I don't
I
know
know,
if he would
but-
do that, right? I would imagine he would probably, hey, right?
But I just, sending that message out is a valuable thing too.
Dominic?
So, Mr. Chair, to that point, I'm not even sure you need the minister's approval to look into shared services. Amalgamation is one, because you're restructuring and changing corporations and all of that, but I don't think anything is stopping us now to do shared services. So that, the one thing I wanted to mention on that, but just out of curiosity for my own understanding. So for example, if I look at the section of budget on sub-watershed rehabilitation, it talks about tree planting, and which is always the contentious one, but or community stewardship projects. So what I would have liked to hear is more options of possibilities and impact. Like the one example you provided is very clear on the impact. This is what it looks like if we do and if we don't. What does it look like if the tree purchases is 50,000 instead of 60,000? Or if stewardship projects are 8,000 instead of 18,000? And I'm not the expert on all of your programs, you are, but just as an example of where I would like to see other options and impact being discussed.
Yeah, so if you're looking at page 39, your sub-watershed rehabilitation, you've got your 3% and your 2%. There's really no difference between the two. You're correct in that. But in terms of, I put a column in there, actions to meet budget target. So the forest and lands technician position is fully funded through outside sources, but is helping some of those core program areas. We've increased the over-counter tree sales from 25 to 50 cents in both scenarios, and pulling 19,000 from reserves to keep the levy contribution to 2019 levels. So if you look at the municipal levy for budget 2019, it was basically 115,354. So I guess I'm fudging the numbers a little bit, but there's 115,567 in levy coming over there now. So in terms of, there's very little movement in that program. That's why I'm not really identifying anything that we can necessarily cut. All of the funds that are in there supporting a contract that we have right now with Ontario Power Generation. So we're committed to tree planting basically at those levels to support that contract that we have with them right now. In terms of the stewardship, that's 100% self-funded. And then we've had previous discussions, I didn't raise it today, but you've got your GIS and data management on page 41. Again, we had a previous report to the board where I think the motion basically said, I asked you guys to consider, do you want to continue the GIS drone services through some type of shared services? The idea was, yes, you did. There was a motion to proceed with that. That really was the only other area that we could seriously look at bringing the budget down, was to say, no, we're pulling back completely from GIS and the drone services and liquidating that. So again, in terms of this budget rendition, I didn't incorporate that in because I thought we had already had that discussion and moved that forward. But if you're looking for significant movement in your levy projections, then it would be within that department, and that's the same department where the bulk of the flood forecasting funds are going currently in terms of looking at that floodplain mapping. But really, that's the only area where we would be saving levy, and, yeah, you could bring yourselves down if we decide, you know what, we need to get rid of the drones, we can't save that program. You get rid of the drones, you could bring it down to 2,000 and do your floodplain mapping with a consultant, but you would be giving up your drones.
And how long before we could make money on the drones?
Well, basically, the way that the budget is set up now is that we would be working with Central Algon to do a shared services.
Right.
So they're basically kind of offsetting those costs. We would be able to make money on the drones, not make money, but we'd be able to recoup some costs almost immediately as soon as we have the staff trained
Okay.
to do that, in terms of doing flights for other municipalities, for Central Algon, or for neighboring CAs.
Great.
In my experience with consultants, we never get ahead with those. It's obviously-
It's like leasing a car.
costs.
Ralph, just through you, question, you people were at a meeting with Mr. Urick. Was he convinced that what he was saying in that letter was really his thoughts, or was that a letter that he had to sign? I don't, you may not wish to answer that, but.
Mr. Urick is a politician, and he works with a group of other people who sit around a table like this. And so I'm sure there was input from other people, but that doesn't mean that he didn't have input into it. Whether he believes it all, doesn't matter. Right? Company policy.
Mhm.
I have to be somewhere at noon, so I might have to leave. How close do you think we are to voting on this? Because I would stay to vote, but because I feel it's really important, but I do crucially.
Do we have any other pressing comments at this point in time?
I've actually got to go too shortly, so I didn't take it last one.
Just one quick comment to, going directly to Catfish Creek without Mr. Urick, and that has happened, we've tried in the past with the flat no, so I don't expect that to change.
So it's the muscle behind it that you're looking for.
I think, Mr. Chair, if the will of the board is to send out a letter like that, I think it gets better traction if you send it to these member municipalities,
And
that this authority is open to shared services and those discussions as part of the budgeting processes moving forward.
Okay. Okay, excellent. Okay. So seeing as we have a number of people who need to vacate the premises, let's bring this down to a,
do you need a motion for the letter?
I would need a motion for a letter. I'm really looking for a motion today, whether you want me to
3%
proceed with a 3% or 2% in 2020 and finish the costing for the other four, for the other three.
okay, let's.
There's no motion. There's no motion. It was meant for discussion. And I was hoping that you guys would land on a recommendation of consensus yourselves, but,
Okay, so I'm looking for a consolidated idea here. Something for Elizabeth to step forward with.
you're either, sorry if I may, you're either looking at a 3% for the next 4 years, or you're looking at a 2% in 2020 and have direct staff to cost out the other 4 years based on a 2% in 2020.
So we're looking at 3% or 2%. Rob?
I'm gonna move that we try and hold the 3%.
Okay, we have a seconder for that? Grant?
Recorded vote, please.
Okay, thank you. Recording vote.
So, Mr. Chair, I think Ralph's motion that the budget be 3% in 2020 and 3% for the next 3 years.
Ralph? Yes?
Yes.
Yes.
So Linda Stevenson's asked for a recorded vote. Dennis Krebitz?
Yes.
Dominique Jaguar?
No.
Grant Jones?
Yes.
Bill Mackey?
Yes.
Joe Preston is absent. Elizabeth Pelosa is absent. Linda Stevenson?
Yes.
Allison Warwick?
Yes.
Ralph Winfield?
Yes.
Stephen Harvey,
Yes.
and that motion passes.
Okay.
So can I make a motion that the board prepare a letter for discussion of shared services?
For our board meeting?
Yeah.
Okay.
And that we discuss also who the letter should be shared with, moving forward, to look for this, to show that we're looking to do our bit.
So Mr. Chair, basically asking you'd be looking to direct staff to prepare a letter for discussion at the
Mhm.
next board meeting. Allison moved. Do we have a seconder?
Bill? All in favor? Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so if I go, you still have quorum?
Yes.
Okay, sorry.
The next report should be fairly,
Right.
but you can go.
Yeah, and I don't care if my per diems get changed.
So this was the last element of the discussions today. Previous boards have foregone any increase to the board per diem. It's been sitting at 86 for some years now. But I thought I would bring it back for the consideration of this board in your first term. You can see that I've collected similar rates from the neighboring CAs, and you're still at 86.09 per meeting. You're still above average. The mileage, though, is something that you may wish to change, so I brought that to your attention as well. We're currently sitting at 47 cents per kilometer. The average is 50 cents. And you can see the federal mileage rate that some of the CAs are using is 58 cents per kilometer for the first 5,000 and 52 cents thereafter. That's really basically for discussion, whether you want to leave it as status quo or leave your per diems as is, and whether or not you want to look at an increase to your mileage, to the mileage.
Thoughts, Bill?
I'm fine with per diem staying the same or above average. I think the mileage could go up a little bit to at least average. It's my thought.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
I didn't hear the second part of that, I'm sorry.
But Bill was okay with the per diem staying the same, but thought that the mileage might want to go up to the average. The average right now is 50 cents a kilometer, and we're sitting at 47.
Okay, thank you.
Done?
I agree with that.
My comment would be that just because we are already above average on per diem, I would leave the mileage unchanged. In other words, I would leave the policy as is.
Okay, Grant?
I'm good at status quo as well.
Ralph, got any thoughts?
Well, I'm easy, you know, it's not gonna make any difference to me one way or the other, so.
Dennis, you got any thoughts on this?
I'm fine with status quo, but at the same point, the mileage is something that should be looked at in
Yes.
time. It can't stay at 47 cents forever.
No,
Right.
yeah. I think that, you know, we have tried very hard to be middle of the road in much of what we do. And I think that mileage is probably the one thing that sticks out there more than anything else. So those are my thoughts. What do you want to do, folks?
I'll move for the status quo.
Okay, motion to remain status quo. We need a seconder. Grant? Grant seconds it. Okay, any other discussion? So this is to leave everything just the way it is? All in favor?
Yes.
Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. So carried. Okay. And that's it. Nothing in closed session. We have a board meeting on the 20th at 10 a.m. Anything else for the good of the cause? Saying nothing. Motion to adjourn? Dismiss? Carried? Done.